Howdy, all you delicious people. Season 3, Episode 7 of American Gods. I think we can really sum up this entire review of this episode by just having to settle upon things. And here's where I go about this. So, how far have we drastically changed this show within the first season from this season? So, let's get this straight. So, we end up having in the early seasons, we end up having like basically like declothed uh, people going at it, and it's spectacular. To then there being Bilquist being blurred to all heavens and like trying as much as possible not to shoot Bilquist and or Bill Sanders really at all. And now, within this episode, we have to rely on the sound of people going at it now. That is, I guess, hopefully going to get somebody's motor running, because when looking at it, I don't know anything else that could have quite possibly gotten anybody's motor running in this episode, in this review. Not meaning it from an SEX standpoint. I'm just meaning it from a just an entire episode standpoint. There is one interaction that I thought was interesting within this entire episode, but everything else was basically just like, man, are they just really just stretching things out or making things utterly pointless within an entire episode. I was just baffled and or godsmacked by how much time we took into tying in one character to basically ending up being resolved the way of which that it goes into. I'm like, how many episodes did we spend on this one person being so utterly viable to what is to go on here? And like, we had to take entire episodes for this character to just be so utterly important, just to have this be such a great, just triumphant moment. So we end up seemingly have Tyrell being otherwise retied to this episode again, but when looking at it, the guy who otherwise is a supposedly tooth fairy of sorts, or a dentist of sorts, it seems that ultimately he is in this show. But I'm like, yeah, he's here, but who cares? We end up having it to where Sam Blackcrow, who ultimately was the Drifteresh-like person that had given Shadow Moon a ride as otherwise in this episode. But again, I can't help but also just go and just say that she is not a character that really has any true, real triumphant relevance of this episode, as well as seemingly anything. We have it to where, like, Salim is in this episode just to really just be in this episode. Like, hey man, like, we need to have this guy in this episode, but what are we gonna do? Well, we're just gonna eventually have it uh, to where really Laura is talking to him yet again, and there is some goofy things going on with TV and so on and so forth, but really there is not much going on there. So, speaking of going on, I think it's about time to go on. Really, I think whoever they can just get or stretch, or whoever the heck needs to be Mr. It World at this point, Could a dog be Mr. World at this point? Could a dog be Miss World at the point? Who cares? Because when we're really looking at it, any of the dialogue doesn't matter. If James Earl Jones or Morgan Freeman was to be Miss World right now and deliver a ground smackingly like in awe performance, I wouldn't care. Um, to be brutally honest, so we ultimately have it to our technical boy. Ultimately has a seemly thing going on in this episode, and I don't care. Any single time that Ultimate Technical Boy is within scenes that are going on in here, and I'm just like, man, I think you could watch this entire episode and just be like, man, I wish I could have just smoked some weed today. Just, oh, while watching the show. Because, I don't know, like, to me, it seemed like a, like, jarbled, jangled mess of just writing in this episode. And a lot of it didn't really go anywhere. It was just kind of all like there was so much stuff done for this episode that didn't go anywhere. There was nothing going on. It was all like there was a lot of stuff of just people pointing out things, and then like there was no real true there is no real true resolution. There's speaking of revolution, they go back in time yet again to put a scene together that is in a past time of revolutions of sorts. But also going into here, I was just like, man, this show just goes out of its way to, I think, try to lose its viewership. It's sad. And ultimately, we still don't even know if is there a war going on? I don't think there is a war going on anymore. Ultimately, it kind of feels like they try to say that there is a war going on, but I can't say that there actually is a war going on. It seems like Odin is in a war within himself, and I think it's probably just going to come down to like Mr. World versus or Mrs. World, whoever it ends up being this week, against Odin, and like I think that's just going to resolve this whole entire thing. Like instead of having an entire army of people fighting, why not it just be literally just two men at this point fighting it out and resolving this whole thing? Because that's the thing that never made sense to me of just like, well, F it. Like, Odin's getting people on his side. Mr. World's getting people on his side. How about we just, like, boxing match, just have these guys fight it out? And then that resolves this entire supposed war instead of having to get 20 bajillion old gods and 20 bajillion new gods that ultimately are never going to pick a side between either one of these characters because they don't want to die and they all want to be neutral. Like, just have it to where ultimately Odin and Mr. World just duke it out. Just come on, finally get to this war, finish it up, call it a show, and it's over. It's over, baby. It's over. That's all you gotta do. That's all you gotta do at this point. So, speaking of which, all we gotta do now is go into spoilers, because, good God, this episode. Like, I don't know how many lines were ultimately, it, like, went from one ear right out the other. Like, so ultimately there's going to be, like, some stuff that I'm going to talk about, but again, a lot of it is just one ear out the other, because ultimately I just feel like I'm watching a show that almost like is like a show where I'm like I'm hearing like half of the lines because like all of a sudden I'm hearing like yeah, like I'm getting emotional. Are you getting emotional? Are you having issues? Are you having problems? Yeah, I'm having problems. Hey, are you gonna be tied to Odin's War? No, I don't want to be tied to Odin's War. Well, I guess that just resolves that then. Like, that's what I feel like every single episode is now. Of just like, hey, I'm gonna take 12 years to get to this one spot. Told me just like, hey, choose a side? No? Oh, okay, well, I guess I'll just leave then, and I'll come back and say boob! Boo, but I'll leave. I'll leave. 12 years, so it's me have so many things be just so unresolved. It's ridiculous at this point. And I. So, let's go into that double five to otherwise go into spoiler time, because good God, if we had a god that ultimately could go into war and just beat the living crap out of somebody, it would be great at this point. But I don't think that's ever going to happen. It's never going to happen in this story. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this show. So, reasonably, this entire episode gets boiled down, in all brutal honesty, to probably 2 to 3 things. So, here's thing one. We end up having it to where Laura ends up actually going and talking to Shadow Moon. And I'm like, whoa, bro, this is exciting. So we end up having it to where Laura ends up going and talking to Shadow Moon. And we end up having Laura, who is like, you know what? I want to kill Mr. Wednesday. So ultimately, Shadow Moon, are you gonna be on my side to go and kill Odin, to kill Mr. Wednesday? And we end up having Shadow Moon going, no, I'm not gonna be on your side. I'm not gonna help you. I'm not gonna tell you exactly where Mr. Wednesday is so you can go after him. Like, I'm not going to help you. And then Laura is like, well, why is it that you are stubbornly so loyal to Mr. Wednesday? Why are you so adamant? And ultimately, we have to her Shadow Moon is saying like, "Well, he's my daddy. He's my pop. He's my old man." And to her ultimately, Laura is just like, "Oh wow, that is an interesting development. Well." I guess I better be hitting the old dusty trail. And then she leaves. So we end up having it to where we find out that Shadow Moon and Laura are now, I guess, ex husband and wife now. I guess considering Laura is dead, I guess that just dissolves or resolves their relationship. AKA Laura, I guess, is somehow going to figure out how to uncremate Mad Sweeney. Because why do they keep showing that silly cremation box and the gold coin? There's got to be something to that at this point because they didn't get to that in this entire episode. So, because we end up having it to where Laura ends up going and talking to Salim, and really we had it to where Salim is ultimately hearing the thrusting of his neighbors via a wall, and we end up having it to where ultimately I believe new media is trying to sway Salim to ultimately go on to their side because we ultimately have it seemingly having it to where Mr. World is ultimately looking at Laura and Salim as maybe quite possibly people to work for Mr. World's side, which I'm like, good God, is Mr. World looking for any little tie to his side that otherwise he is going for Laura and Salim out of all people? Because we end up having it where ultimately Salim, I guess, is desperate because he's hearing the thumping of his neighbors next door, and we end up having it to where uh, Salim is watching a program with local gay shingles or singles or whatever. So we end up having it to where it seems that the TV is just tailoring itself for Salim, ultimately having it to where like the TV is mentioning like, yeah, Salim, this is for you. And Salim's like, what? Like, it said my name. The TV said my name. And Laura is like, oh, well, yeah, that's all well and good. Are you going to go and... like, I think you desperately need some gin loving, if you know what I mean. You need to go and knock some gin boots right now. Where the heck is he? Where is that gin kind of thing? So, really, that's all that Salim really has going on in this episode is just like a bunch of dialogue that goes nowhere. To eventually have it to where Salim or to where Laura is just ultimately telling what she's going to do next with Salim, and then she just goes off to go to Shadow Moon and talk with him. So it really seems that in this episode we end up having a past flashback, which I too have believed to have both Tyrell and Odin in this flashback, I guess, as redcoats, or I guess as or not redcoats, like during that kind of time period, during the Revolutionary War, I believe, um, where we had like George Washington and all that jazz. We end up seemingly having it to where we go on and have a showcasing telling us that Tyrell and Odin, like, this is a flashback of showing us when it was the first time that Odin had seen Demeanor. And I was like, okay, so this is to tell us that Demeanor was the most beautiful woman that Odin had ever seen. And what is going to happen with any of this now? So we end up having it to where this is an episode where it seems that Demeanor is planning her escape. It seems that ultimately Odin is tying himself onto one of the security people named Hank. And it seems like in this episode, Odin is playing matchmaker with Hank. And ultimately we have it to where Odin mentions that he doesn't need any drugs. He is the drug. And so, and I'm like, oh my god. Hot garbage this episode is. So we end up having it to where bizarrely that Odin is playing matchmaker for Hank, and we have it to where reasonably we have Odin going to Demeanor, and she is bizarrely dropping pots, and we have it to where Demeanor is blaming these pot droppings, even though she's doing it herself, she's blaming it on Odin. And so Hank ends up going into the, like, I need to figure out all this business. What's going on with these pots? And we have to Odin's like, well, I'm sorry, Hank. You know what? I was so busy trying to pick out the best flowers for you and your date that ultimately I was just so clumsy and I was just dropping plots left and right. You know. Okay, so we end up having it to where, and I'll get to Demeanor, where we end up demeaning this character by the end of this episode. So we end up having it to where Laura and Shadow Moon end up walking out of his apartment with the whole resolution of like Shadow Moon cannot help Laura, and Laura isn't going to, considering now she is alive fully fledgedly and doesn't have bugs all around her flying around. You would think that Laura would have been getting some boatloads of humping going on with her and Shadow Moon just to ultimately resolve this whole relationship thing. But no, we end up having it to ultimately we have seemingly where is it? Where the we end up having. I wanna say what her name is. Oh, um, Margaret, 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 Margaret. Good God, uh, Shadow Moon's property manager, I guess, is what we'll have to call her, because I'm not going to try to mispronounce that name 80 bajillion times. We end up having Shadow Moon's property manager coming into the fray, and we have it to where Laura and Shadow Moon will end up hugging, but then when Shadow Moon's property manager ends up walking into the fray, we end up having it to where Shadow Moon thrusts Laura away, ultimately having Laura going like, like, oh, so this is your new slice of pie, hey Shadow Moon. So we end up having it to where Laura is really talking up Shadow Moon and how he's a really nice guy, and ultimately they have to confirm that ultimately Laura and him are now um, like an ex couple, basically really showcasing to you that these people are really going to further along go their own paths and never really be probably tied to one another again because story. So we end up having Laura talking Shadow Moon's property manager into just good graces and whatever, realizing that this is ultimately going to be Shadow Moon's new slice of pie. So we end up having Laura going off, reminding Shadow Moon told me, say, hey, remember to give that message to your father that I'm coming for him, kind of thing. So we end up having Shadow Moon end up going and listening to the greatest hits of, I would assess, Belle Biv DeVoe, I think, but I could be wrong. Or maybe it's New Edition. I'm not quite sure. But we end up having Shadow Moon ultimately painting his way through his room, and we end up having the property manager ending up kind of sneaking into his room, and we end up having Shadow Moon end up going and dancing around with his shirt off and looking all six packish, and we end up having Shadow Moon dancing around, and we end up having it to where ultimately he ends up getting scared the living daylights out of his property manager, just like sneaking behind him to watch him dance and paint his walls. And so he ends up getting scared, and ultimately we have it to where um, his property manager is to tell Shadow Moon that they are having a town meeting. And so we end up having it to where there is a town meeting that is ultimately to talk again about this missing girl. Really, towards the end of this episode, we do seemingly have it to where Shadow Moon ends up running after a woman of sorts. We also have it to where Sam Blackcrow has some tying to this episode, which ultimately is to kind of have a little bit of a chat with Shadow Moon to ultimately kind of have it to where Sam Blackcrow is otherwise tied to Shadow Moon's property manager. So I guess that's interesting. So, or retying, I guess, whichever. But we end up having it to where Shadow Moon ends up going to this town meeting, and really everybody in this town meeting is to basically tell Chad Mulligan, the town sheriff, that ultimately he's doing such a bang up job. That ultimately it seems that people in the town are ultimately getting restless because this girl hasn't been found yet. Ultimately, they've been saying, like, hey, like, you should never ever be resting, Chad Mulligan. You should never be sleeping whatsoever at all. If anything, you should never ever go home and sleep. You need to be consistently 24/11, 25 days out of the year. Uh, it's a joke. 25/11. You need to be going and looking for this girl, and you haven't found her yet. And so you are doing such a crappy job at finding this girl and resolving this case that everybody is in a town uproar. And ultimately, we are also to tell that seemingly uh, that uh, that Anne Mary Heselman ultimately is to seemingly be getting to have much more jobs and much more duties into this town. And we end up having Shadow Moon going like, "Good God, do you think that this girl does enough?" Like uh, she ends up going and doing a movie slash general store, and now she's also like doing any number of other things. So we end up having to ultimately the sheriff is ultimately telling everyone that he's trying the best that he can to resolve this case, but it seems that this is going to be a case that is going to end up being served cold. So we end up moving on. So we end up having it to where Shadow Moon ends up finding a woman all beanied up, and we have it to where she is just running through the forest. And we have it to where ultimately Shadow Moon is running after her, and eventually she had dropped bags of what is, I guess, to be lingerie, which is so weird that ultimately we have Shadow Moon that has to go and try to see what these things in these bags are to ultimately realize it's lingerie. So evidently, I would assess that either this girl has a weird fetish of sorts, or otherwise, like, this girl just loves to be chased by men, so that way they could see her lingerie. It's freaking weird. I didn't understand what the heck any of this was. Maybe I'm assessing that this girl was the missing girl, or maybe this was the girl who was taking the girls. I don't know. I didn't quite understand what any of that scene was. This show is so confusing at some points, and ultimately, when looking at it, probably there are people that could narrow down some things going on in these episodes that I'm kind of just like, what is going on? But, anyways, so within this episode, so we end up having it to where Odin and Demeanor are having this play on Hank to ultimately just say like, well, hey man, we're definitely going to like get you your eHarmony perfect match. It's going to happen. Like, if anything, like, Odin is bizarrely playing Cupid for some effing reason. We end up having it to where Odin ends up putting up a play of sorts to ultimately have certain characters be portraying Demeter and Odin and so on and so forth. Like, it's a play of sorts, but it's kind of like a bizarrish play that ultimately I think it's kind of more like shadow puppets or something like that. It's a bizarrish like approach to this story. So we end up having it to where they end up doing this bizarrish play, which ultimately takes from behind a screen of sorts. And what ends up happening is we end up having it to where Demeanor ends up going off into the, like, basically fading away Thanos style into the sky. She ends up dying, I would assess, and moving on to what I would say is uh, quite possibly going to have to be Valhalla. So we end up having it to where Odin and Shadow Moon's fiance had taken so much effing time to tie themselves onto Demeanor, really showing us the very first appearance of Demeanor, like as if we're pulling out her comic book and try to giving you a clear origin story that wasn't exactly 100% clear and didn't really exactly matter. We end up having this character ending up just Thanos styling, snapping her way out of existence into what I would assess would be Valhalla, and we have it to where Odin is watching this confetti-ness going on, and he's like, Demeanor, no, don't die, justifiably, because you should have, because when looking at it, like, heaven forbid we actually do anything that is going to resolve and clarify that Demeanor is going to be part of this war, or any number of these people are going to have any real true stories going on that are going to matter. Tyrell being in here, I'm like, what was the point of him? Like, the blips in the showcasing of Tyrell being in here didn't exactly matter exactly. Like, everything was just kind of just hodgepodgingly put together to just really stretch the crap into this episode. Because we end up having it to where Technical Boy is going and seemingly he is having some feelings, some new feelings, some emotional problems, some emotional distress. To ultimately he is going into his to his war game setup of going and talking to a computer, and we have this computer ultimately like asking him kind of like, how do you feel, kind of thing, and like, would you like, or shall we play a game, kind of thing, and all this other bizarrish nonsense where we have to our Technical Boys like, God, I'm having all these new feelings because of this virus that is going on that Bilquist had done to me. I'm having feelings and emotions. I can't control them. So we ultimately have it to where Mr. World is ultimately having to drag Technical Boy into his office to have Mr. World basically asking Technical Boy, like, hey, what exactly is going on with you? Like, I need to narrow this down of what the heck is going on with you, Technical Boy. And we end up having it to our Technical Boy is like, well, maybe it's just stress because ultimately before, like, I was almost being replaced by new media and all these other schlubs that ultimately weren't half as good as I was. So, like, I think now I'm just kind of reaching to the point of no return. And so, ultimately, we have it to where Technical Boy ends up going off, and Mr. World is just like, well, hey, like, if I can't get Technical Boy, then maybe I'll go and I'll get Laura and I'll get Salim and tie them into my side. And I'm like, so F all the gods, let's go and get like the normal like Laura human because I'm assessing that she's not a leprechaun and Salim is a normal person and I'm like, okay, so what is it going to be, just a war of numbers? Like if there's like one god that goes against like 100 human beings, then I think we should be good, right? I think really that is just the real true tail end of this episode is to ultimately just talk about Mr. World being yet another different actor. Ultimately, a very legendary actor, we can say that, so I guess we can be very appreciative of the fact that ultimately Mr. World is in here as at least a legendary-ish like actor. Um, but reasonably, I'm just like, so are they just gonna keep makeshifting this Mr. World character, just kind of otherwise appease people to get a much more renowned actor, but ultimately still a lower budget probably actor at some point? I don't know. When going through these episodes, I'm just like, man, has this show just really just deflated itself, to be brutally honest. So at the end of the day, I think that's all I'm going to say to otherwise save time and get out of here. I really do uh, I apologize for how overly undetailed and how everything kind of quickly is just summed up. But when looking at it, there is nothing really worthwhile going on into these episodes. And so a lot of the dialogue gets thrown out the window consistently because there is not enough real, true, interesting things going on into this episode. Like, there's no war, there's no. It's like, there's not even anything really truly in these episodes. Like, even the Laura and the Shadow Moon part, I was like, man, am I really stretching to say that that is the most, like, important thing in this episode? Because there's nothing going on throughout this episode that ultimately I felt, besides the death of Demeanor, there's nothing going on in this episode. Nothing! It's nothing! So ultimately, when looking at it, I think they're gonna save the last episode. The best thing that they can do is have something to go on with this last episode that is going to be a big oomph. Like, I'm assuming that there's going to be a death of somebody again. There's going to be probably, it's going to end up that it's going to be either Odin or it's going to be Laura or it's something going to be that big. But at the end of the day, um, I don't think it'll actually really matter. This show is really sadly fizzled out to an exhausting degree. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.